Hello, I'm Lucas Salbert, and I'll be presenting environmental learning for robot path planning. Here is a robot. This particular robot is NASA's Mars Perseverance rover. It was hand engineered. Basically, every single system on this robot was designed specifically for Mars by human beings. As an environment, Mars offers unique challenges. There are, for instance, rocks that can pierce the rover's wheels and sand that can trap the rover. Also, Mars is 13 light minutes away, which means that direct control of the rover in real time is impossible. Consider perhaps the opposite environment, like an Amazon warehouse. In contrast to Mars, the floor is completely smooth, and the environment is mapped perfectly. Also, there is a low latency internet connection, and it's possible, for instance, to deploy advanced machine learning algorithms. On the other hand, there are potentially multiple robots, as well as human beings in the space, and these are other factors that a robot here will have to account for. Considering the differences between Mars and an Amazon warehouse brings us to the central goal of this thesis, which is to specialize robots to new environments. So, conventionally, robots have been hand engineered. As a field, we're moving away from this and towards machine learning. In general, this means being proficient at tasks, right, at some specified tasks. But in the context of this thesis, it means specializing to different tasks and different environments. On the right, we have an image which is fairly profound. This is an image from Darwin's notebook, presumably from when he first thought of evolution. Here is an artist's depiction of the same image. Basically, it shows the lineages of different groups and species. On the left, we have bacteria and several other groups all the way up to mammals. And here there are eventually 8.7 million species, and people can spend lifetimes studying just one of these groups. So the goal of this thesis is to do the same thing that nature did, but with computer programs instead of species. And this is known as evolutionary programming. Here is a teaser figure showing how evolutionary programming might work. In this figure, we have an initial program that has eventually evolved to other programs that fulfill different needs based on some score. That's the core idea of program evolution, and I'll talk about it in depth later. The task that we are specializing to is path planning in different environments. So path planning is the task of, if there are multiple points in space, how do we find a sequence of moves between them? So there are two main types of path planning. Those are graph-based path planning and sample-based path planning. Graph-based path planning defines moves in advance in the form of a discrete graph. Sample-based path planning instead samples moves from the environment. On the left, we have a good example of this. So a robot is tasked with moving from the orange dot in the bottom left to the purple dot in the top right. And to move between these 2 points, the robot samples in space and creates these blue lines to get around the black obstacles. There are other kinds of path planning, such as dynamic planning or multi-agent planning, and there are also other things that are closely related to this thesis. We do not consider them. Here's an example of graph-based path planning. In this example, we have a map of New York, where roads are colored based on whether an algorithm considered them or not. So black represents roads that are unconsidered, and pink represents roads that are considered. Yellow represents the eventual path that our robot found. Basically, we'd like to reduce the amount of pink roads. As you can see, the choice of algorithm can be the difference of hundreds of thousands of roads considered. The difference between these two algorithms is that a human gave them a heuristic, which is a way of knowing how far away they are from the goal. It was human engineered. But the goal of this thesis is, instead of human engineered, to automatically generate these differences in path planners. So among graph-based path planners, we consider 4 relatively simple algorithms. These are breadth-first search, depth-first search, Dijkstra, and ASAR. There are actually many other algorithms. For instance, Hannah Bass et al. of Microsoft Research and the University of Freiburg has a good summary paper on all of these different algorithms. If you're interested in learning, say, how an algorithm in Google Maps works, then that is the place to go. In sampling-based path planning, there are two main categories. First is rapidly exploring random trees, and second is probabilistic roadmaps. So rapidly exploring random trees have the most variance by far. However, we actually only consider the simple variance. What's interesting is that the more advanced variants are all specialized to different types of tasks, and this thesis focuses on exactly the same thing. How do we evolve programs for new tasks? Also, probabilistic roadmaps are very interesting. They combine sampling and graph-based planning. So basically they sample and then create a graph and then use a graph-based planner to find the eventual path. And they're also interesting, and I'll talk about them in future work. Here's the basic idea behind RRT star. So RRT star, like we've said, is a sampling-based path planner. So here's a map on the left, and points essentially are sampled uniformly on this map. So we choose an XY coordinate, and then we look around the XY coordinate for other nodes. And if they are close enough, and if there is some obstacle between us and them, then we make a connection and build a tree using that. On the right, we have a visualization of how this happens. So the basic operating principle of RRT star is Voronoi regions. These are what is depicted in orange. So these regions depict if you sample a point in space and it falls within this region, then the other point in that region is the closest point. And so, for instance, if I sample right here, I will choose this point. And because of that, that is how RRT star rapidly explores, because the area of these Voronoi regions is proportional to the probability that we sample a point within them. And so this biases the RRT star to move towards the larger areas. Here's an overview of the different maps considered in this thesis. From top to bottom, we have Baldur's Gate, Dragon Age Origins, Warcraft, and Starcraft. These are different video game maps. Below this, we have maps from major cities, and these are from Boston, Shanghai, Milan, Paris, and so on. Next, we have mazes and Amazon warehouses. We consider all these different maps mostly because they have unique characteristics that are interesting. So, for Boston, it is fairly cluttered, except there are a few open spaces, say here and up here. Shanghai, this particular map of Shanghai, happens to be rather open. On the other hand, the mazes, are open, but actually, you can sample points within them, but it's hard to connect points that are sampled. All of these other maps have interesting characteristics as well. This map, in particular, has two open spaces, but in between them, there is only a single pixel passage. And this type of problem is exceptionally difficult for RRT star. The point of this thesis, however, is to learn new algorithms that perform better on each of these different maps. Here's a teaser figure to that effect. Basically, in the top left, we have Boston, and then a planner which is specialized to work on this particular map of Boston. And the same goes for each of these other figures. And these are real planners that eventually came from some of the experiments I'll show at the end of this talk. The only takeaway now is simply that it's possible, and I'm not the first person to realize that this is fairly possible. In fact, I think a lot of people would say that they knew that you could do this. So that concludes the abstract of this thesis. And now I'll move into the methods. So here is the Mandelbrot set. So I'm showing you a picture of the Mandelbrot set because it brings us to an important figure in program synthesis. That figure is Kolmogorov. Kolmogorov considered program synthesis for compression. And compression is related to the Mandelbrot set because the Mandelbrot set is a perfect example of compression. The Mandelbrot set, for instance, can be generated with like 200 lines of Python code. In contrast, the image that is output by that code can be up to 2 megapixels. And this difference between the size of the Python code and the size of the generated image is what makes it good for compression. And that's why Andrei Kolmogorov considered it for program synthesis. His core result in considering program synthesis for compression was this. Searching program space exhaustively is impossible because of Turing's halting problem. However, a lot of other research has indicated that basically, if we can search through program space in some way, we can create optimal ordered problem solvers, or even universal problem solvers. That work is mostly done by Schmidhuber and Lennart. Another honorable mention in the world of program synthesis is is done by Brendan Lake and Joshua Tannenbaum. This paper basically looked at Bayesian program learning for character recognition. The core takeaway from that paper is that representation matters. This means the learned representation from some machine learning technique is extremely important in that technique's ability to generalize. So my core point of this thesis is that many problems are program learning in disguise. And here I provide a template that allows us to classify different important computer science problems and how they fit into program learning. So program learning has a problem, some base problem. For instance, image classification. Image classification has a learned representation. This learned representation happens to be neural network weights. We optimize these neural network weights using gradient methods. This is the basic idea behind image recognition and neural network classifiers. However, it fits into this approach template. And I argue that anything that fits this template is basically a form of program learning. Now, I will introduce you to meta-learning. The word meta means referring to itself or to the conventions of a genre, or self-referential. With that definition in mind, meta-learning means learning to learn. And in this sense, I cover an AutoML paper, which is learning to learn. This paper was done by Real et al. At Google Research, and the problem they consider is, at its core, image classification, but they learned to learn how to do image classification, and so they use an AutoML classifier. The representation of choice, instead of neural network weights, is as a tensor machine. This means instead of learning a neural network, they basically learn operations on tensors, on matrices, vectors, and other mathematical objects. And this basically is what they use to do classification. They find this total machine using regularized evolution. Regularized evolution is a type of genetic programming. And now I'll explain what genetic programming is. So, there are evolutionary and genetic algorithms. These are basically a form of population optimization. So in population optimization, you have a population which is members. And these members, for instance, can be points in space. So in this case, I have a toy example where the members are points in space. They can be encoded as other things too, for instance, computer programs. And if the members are computer programs, then that's called evolutionary programming. In our example, we have points in space, and they have a defined fitness score. This fitness score is simply the sum of their x component and their y component. And so, basically, population members in the top right are better. The core principle of population optimization is that we're trying to optimize this fitness score. We're trying to make it go up. And so, we do this via selection, mutation, and crossover. So selection refers to filtering this population to only let better members through and let those members reproduce. So, how do these members change? Well, that happens through mutation and crossover. In our example, mutation can be randomly changing a single coordinate of one of these points, and crossover can be swapping the x and y coordinates of two different points. Crossover basically is supposed to be an analogy to how human DNA works. And in this figure, I basically show that after 3 applications of selection, the population as a whole increases in fitness. That's a basic introduction to evolutionary and genetic algorithms. Now I'll explain regularized evolution. So regularized evolution uses a queue. In this queue, the population is sorted by the age of its members. So you have young members of the population at the top and old members of the population at the bottom. From this population, we sample, say, 1/10 of it. In this sample, we determine the best member, and this member is selected based on its fitness. Then, we mutate this member and put it at the top of the queue, which makes it the youngest. Also, we discard the oldest member. In this way, we've done one iteration of regularized evolution. If we do this 1,000 times, then over time, we improve the fitness of our population, and that's how regularized evolution works. Here's the core result of the AutoML0 paper. On the left, we have the y-axis. The y-axis shows the accuracy of a CFAR10 classifier. On the x-axis, which is logarithmic, we have the number of algorithms evaluated. So these algorithms are tensor programs, basically operations on vectors and matrices. And so in this scenario, after considering 10 billion computer programs, essentially through random search, we go from an empty algorithm to a linear model, which has 70% accuracy. After doing 10 billion iterations of random search, we go from 10 billion algorithms to 1 trillion algorithms. In this journey, basically we find, or AutoML0 by Rail et al. Finds, that there are all these different machine learning practices that can be added on to an algorithm. So for instance, stochastic gradient descent, and then learning rates, ReLU, and so on are added over time. Basically, they eventually learn an algorithm that looks like this. This is somewhat representative of a common modern machine learning algorithm, and it was learned from scratch. This representation, like I've talked about, is a tensor register machine. Essentially, there are vectors, there are scalars, and there are matrices. They're held in registers, so there's a memory component, and all they do is define several functions which operate on these registers. And through this, they evolve machine learning algorithms. With that in mind, I'll talk about how our approach relates to their approach. So, environment learning for path planning also fits into the program learning template. Basically, the core problem is path planning. The representation, the learned representation of a path planner is pure Python code. This Python code is optimized using a method called Pareto evolution. Now I'll talk more about Pareto evolution, Python code, and path planning. So, here, as a reminder, is a path planner. Path planners, for instance, can be written in Python. This is a toy example of what RRT star might look like. So RRT star works by creating a tree and then continually sampling new points and adding those points to the tree while rewiring nearby points. In this way, it's a simple path planner, but basically this is a code representation. And what we would like to do is modify this code representation as is, because if we do so, we have code that is highly interpretable and interfaces with existing Python code. So we do exactly that. This shows an evolvable Python program, which is doing RRT star. However, now it's broken up into 2 separate functions, build and sample. In these functions, certain lines are evolvable and other lines aren't. In the build function, we only evolve parameters. In the sample function, we evolve everything. So basically this shows you that there are many different operating parameters within each of these codes, right? And so, for instance, in the sampling function, that's what happens when we sample points in space, and either it's uniform or potentially biased, right? And what's important is that there are high-level parameters that control these behaviors. So there's a step size, a rewiring radius, the total number of nodes, and then the biasing chance. And here's a quick table which shows how two algorithms might vary in these parameters. They can also vary in structural code, for instance, if they add an if statement or a new assignment statement or something like that. But they can be quickly classified by their parameters. And also, the Python code itself can be referred to by its MD5 hash. And this allows us to uniquely identify Python programs in their genotypes. So the way that Python programs are evolved is by using the evolvable Python grammar. So in this grammar, the simplest thing is constants. So if we're going to mutate a Python code, we can change a constant, for instance from a 0 to a 1. We can also change the names of local variables, for instance x to y. The same can be said for function names, binary operators, and so on. We can also make abstract changes to the code. For instance, we can change an atomic expression, like just x, to a binary expression, like x plus y. And we can do that with many other abstract statements as well. We can also compose abstract statements to form more complex statements. And that's how basically a Python grammar works. And that's what fuels our mutation operator. Here is a basic example of how evolving Python programs goes in practice. So on the y-axis, we have a population of Python programs. These are mutated once initially, and as you can see, they're very different colors. These colors represent different Python errors. So from here, we have Python exceptions that happen when you run the code. And then in green, we have functional planners, which do something, but behave essentially the same. And then in purple, we have superior planners, which are somewhat better in some metric. And so what you can see is that we start with rather bad planners, right? A lot of them are cheating, based on cheating errors. And so over time, we apply selection, like I introduced in the evolutionary programming slide. And by applying selection for simply validity and superiority, we can create a population which is more functional. By doing this, we can evolve Python code and interpret it when it's done evolving. So, path planning actually has multiple objectives. When we do path planning, like with one of those trees that I showed, basically we care about two things: how much computation was used, and how long was the eventual path that we found. So nodes is a proxy to how much computation was done, and path length is the path itself. Here is a plot showing on the x-axis the number of nodes, and on the y-axis the path length. These are different Python programs which do path planning, and as you can see, they make trade-offs between the number of nodes and the path length. However, some of these programs are strictly better than others, and this motivates the optimization methods that we use. So like I've said, the population is composed of these members. Each member has at least two criteria that form their fitness. This fitness is vectorized into both the nodes and the path. By considering this, we get the idea of Pareto equivalence. So two nodes, 2 points in space, are Pareto equivalent if they are not strictly superior in their metrics. So V1, for instance, is Pareto equivalent to V2 because it considers a path length of 151, while V2 considers a path length of 155. So V1 is better in path length. However, V2 considers 60 nodes, while V1 considers 80 nodes. In this sense, they only make a trade-off. The same can be said for V3, and because V3 is also equivalent to 1 and 2, it is in the same Pareto equivalent set, and we call this set a Pareto front. You can see this front as this line drawn through these points. Next, we have V4. V4 is not in this Pareto front because it is strictly outperformed by V1. And in this case, we have 153, which is more than 151, and we have 130, which is more than 80, and that's why it is not Pareto equivalent and is in the next Pareto front. So considering these Pareto fronts brings us to Pareto evolution. Basically, we have a population of members. These members are Python codes. These members are then mutated to produce children. From the combined pool of both population and children, we sort into Pareto fronts using the process I just showed. The final population is then selected from the best Pareto fronts. and then the other half is discarded. Importantly, within a particular Pareto front, we do weighting for crowding, and this encourages genotypic optimization, genotypic diversity, I mean. So here I have a comparison between Pareto evolution and regularized evolution. So Pareto evolution has multiple objectives. It supports a vectorized fitness. It also changes the entire population every iteration. Alternatively, regularized evolution is single objective and only changes one member at a time. The other thing is that Pareto evolution is considered to be somewhat slow because it runs an O of g times n squared time, and it's this square factor that makes it slow. Now regularized evolution, on the other hand, runs an essentially linear time relative to the number of generations. Now this expression is for the total optimization time period, right? Because it considers generations and the total population size. However, because Pareto evolution and regularized evolution differ in bandwidth, Pareto evolution is only O of mn per change because it makes n changes per iteration. On the other hand, regularized evolution is O of p because it is sampling based. However, we can also make Pareto evolution be sampling based, and in this case, per change, Pareto evolution is O of mp if sampled. Here is the main experiment that shows what this thesis is about. So here we have 6 different maps. On the top left, we have the street map's Milan map. It's fairly open in the middle, but very cluttered on the sides, and it's used as a control. The blank map is also used as a control, and as you can see, it's pathological because it's completely open. The Baldur's Gate map is used to validate, and it's fairly cluttered, and is a very good validation map. The StarCraft maps, Enigma, Entanglement, and Turbo, are used as the main experiment. The core idea is that maybe we can learn specific algorithms for each of these different maps. So here is the results of this experiment. Basically, you can see that for each map, there's a different path planner, and in some cases, this is the best planner, in some cases, it's the worst. And all that this slide is meant to show is that the planners on these slides are different for every map. And so you can see the hash of the planner, and then its behavior, and the hash and its behavior, and so on. So I'll dive through these in detail. Basically, first we have the Milan map. On the left is the best planner, on the right is the worst. You can see the best planner works basically by taking very large steps, like throughout the space. However, it does not bias towards the goal. The worst planner takes very small steps, but actually ends up covering the search space fairly evenly. Here we have the Enigma and Entanglement planners, right? This is the best planner on the Enigma map, best planner on Entanglement. And these are both StarCraft maps. So interestingly, both of these planners are very effective in their environments, right? So they're able to get through fairly cluttered hallways in relatively few nodes. And the same can be said for the Entanglement planner. The kicker is, these two planners are identical, but they evolved independently. And this is an example of convergent evolution. Here we have other planners. This is the Turbo planner, and it learns to bias towards the goal half of the time, presumably because the map is more open. Next, we have the blank map planner, and as you can see, it goes directly towards the goal, which is exactly what this experiment was meant to show. Here we have a table summarizing the statistics of all these planners I just showed you. So as you can see, on almost every map, the planners learn to perform better. However, they do so in different ways, and that's what's shown here. So for the Milan planner, it jacks up its step size all the way to 50,000. However, it does not change its bias. For Enigma and Entanglement, they change both the step size and the bias. Turbo and No Obstacles, on the other hand, only change the bias, but you can see that the bias here is rather low, or rather high, and then here it's in the middle, and then here it's rather low. And this is inverse bias, actually. And so this means that No Obstacles biases towards the goal 89% of the time, while these bias towards the goal 13% of the time. So the goal of this thesis was to specialize computer programs in the same way that natural evolution specializes computer programs. Here is a plot showing how one of these evolution runs happens. So we start with an initial planner, which is in light red. This is the name of the planner, and then we have the nodes considered in the pathway. From this planner, we evolve 3 more planners, and then those in turn have children. You can see they are colored by their considered nodes. Basically, red is bad and white is better. So, what's interesting is that this planner is immediately good. It becomes a slightly worse planner, and the space around this planner is bad. But after this planner is the best planner that the optimization finds in terms of considered nodes. And so it had to go through this planner to get there, and that's very interesting. We can use graphs like this to understand the population evolution, and this is the core point of this thesis, is basically to start from something that's somewhat bad and to get to something that's better. But these dots are all Python programs that do a very serious robotics task. And here are the population dynamics. This happens to be for the blank map, which is rather pathological. The colors at the top show different Python programs, and they're all unique. So here we have the phenotypic frequencies plot. On the y-axis we have frequency, and on the x-axis we have iterations, and this goes to 10 iterations because the blank map is fairly easy to learn. So, next we have the Prio friend. Basically this shows the initial planner. It considered 19 nodes and had a path length of 138. As you can see, the initial planner stopped being high frequency in the population, and other planners started taking over. And as you can see, basically red ended up being the most popular planner. Basically, it moves like this. And this, in the bottom left, is the Prio optimal front, and it converged exactly to it. Here is a slightly harder experiment, the StarCraft entanglement map. So in the same way, we start over here with the blue planner, and we fill out this Prio front with the cyan and pink nodes. However, very quickly, the yellow and green are introduced to the population. And as you can see, those form a second Prio front. This Prio front is somewhere in the middle, and it contains also this purple planner. Finally, at around 15 iterations, the red planner is found, and this strictly outperforms all of the other planners, and so it is chosen for the final Prio front and overcomes the population. However, not all of the population dynamics are so clean. Here is the StarCraft Enigma experiment. Basically, this shows the same thing that the other experiments have showed. We start with a planner that is somewhat bad, and then evolve planners that are better. However, the way that happens, as you can see, can be somewhat complicated. Now we'll talk about future work. So, future work, something that I left out of, something that is worth considering is more algorithms. So basically there are many advanced route planning algorithms, like those by Hannah Bass, and then advanced sampling algorithms, like all of the RRT variants and probabilistic roadmaps. Also, there are interesting high-dimensional environments, and these are typically used as benchmarks of like path planners. So one example is the alpha puzzles, basically moving apart 2 pieces that are interlinked in a very specific way. Third, there may be improvements we can make to optimization. For instance, Prio evolution could have more stable or unique population dynamics, and it could also be faster, as we pointed out. Here was the core thesis of this thesis. Basically, I argue that many important problems in computer science are program learning. This argument is done by classification. So basically, a lot of problems, learning problems, have a specific representation and optimization. Basically, almost any problem in computer science that's doing machine learning can fit into this, which is to say that it's all program learning, it always has been. What's behind this is the idea that across all problems, any optimization method is as good as any other. In other words, there is no free lunch. However, it is this fact that there is no free lunch that enables us to do meta-learning and specialization. Thank you.